Hello, welcome to the Journey of Grief, Becoming Us Without Them. I'm Barbara Field, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and today I've invited three other therapists to come and share with us about their work with grief. Part of my goal for that is that therapy is an essential part of recovering from traumatic events and in particular grief. So I'm hoping that as you listen to these lovely folks that you will think, therapy could be good for me. So let's start with Dawn. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your work?
Sure. My name is DiRaimondo. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Sacramento, California, and I work with people around issues around significant grief and loss, depression, anxiety. And my own grief journey began in 2004 when I lost my brother Michael when he was 22 in Iraq. He was a flight medic in the Army. And so I was actually a newly licensed therapist at the time, and it really not only changed my life and my family, but it changed my work. And over time, I ended up doing more and more grief and loss work, people who've lost siblings, children's, partners, things like that. And so now sibling loss is kind of a big specialty of mine. I ended up writing a book about it in 2020. And it's, of course, near and dear to my heart. And actually, surviving siblings are referred to as the forgotten mourners
Oh,
because so much of the support goes to their parents who've lost a child, including the sibling themselves. And so not only does society not understand grief, but their own grief goes wildly unrecognized. They're undersupported. If they lost someone in their 20s or 30s, chances are their friends and partners haven't even experienced significant loss at all. So they tend to avoid the topic, and people end up feeling really alone and often don't even know anyone else who's lost a sibling. So a lot of my work is around validating how deeply impactful losing a sibling is, and really kind of educating them not only about grief, but what it's like to lose a sibling. And there's all these different nuances to that. And then I help people find ways to integrate them in their life still and cope and connect them to resources. And that's kind of in a nutshell, sort of what my work is now.
wow, that's wonderful. It's great that you discovered this group of people that doesn't get seen and tended to.
Right.
Thank you. Okay, David, how about you?
Yeah, David Silva Howell, and I am with Community Counseling Associates in Fair Oaks. I am an associate MFT, but I'm also a retired hospice chaplain. And so that brings in a dimension in terms of my grief work. And I'm also very involved with the Sacramento Bereavement Network, which has just turned out to be a marvelous group. We are meeting quarterly and we're bringing professionals just like you together in terms of our conversations. And so I think that that's just really key. I find that in my work with grief, with those that are clients, excuse me, that so much of our society has tried to move people through grief very quickly. And even in terms of telling people in a couple of months, it's like, well, it's time to get over it. And, looking at my own grief journey in terms of brother and mother and father, they'll always be with me. And of course, the more research that is out there is that we're wanting to encourage people that you don't have to push people away that have died, that you can always have them with you. And so I appreciate the opportunity to do that. I do grief groups. I also do at several locations each year bereavement holiday services because holidays can be very difficult for people. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much. That's great work. And it's good to know about all those widening options. So, Curtis, how about you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Barbara. It's great to be here. I'm excited for this. So, I'm located here in Sacramento as well. I have a group practice, which is a team of clinicians, and we all specialize in co occurring dual diagnosis issues. So, I started my work focusing on addiction, wanted to blend addiction and mental health, saw the prevalence of trauma in both of those aspects. And so I have a practice that specializes in trauma, addiction, mental health, co-occurring issues. And certainly grief is prevalent throughout all of those. I think grief is unique in that way that it's something we all experience, can't get away from it. And we tend to see a lot of traumatic grief in those situations, whether it's in the realm of addiction where there's overdose and seeing someone overdose, or losing a friend in front of you, or loved ones losing a loved one to overdose, or violence or crime, or a lot of those kind of unexpected traumatic losses. And so we are tending to do a lot of that grief and trauma work co-occurring together. It just gets a little bit more complicated.
That's great. And so you do a lot of that body-based kind of therapy, like the meditative, or trying to get it out of your nervous system, not just your attitude. So these are all of this is helping people to notice what's going on and not try to pretend that it's not. So that's great to have you all. So I asked you each to offer a topic of conversation for us to chew on. And so the first one is David. So David asked us to talk about grief and culture. So David, how about getting us started with that?
Well, when you consider the idea of grief and culture, even within our own families, we have a culture about grief. My journey with grief started pretty early. My dad was an airline pilot, and he was supposed to go out on a flight, and they switched to the last moment, and another pilot went out, and that plane went down. And so here we are in a very small town in terms of a kind of an airline family. And that whole ethos of having adults die, having the idea that it could have been my dad dying, but also the idea of a community that mourned. And mourning is a very collective experience. And actually, that's why when people don't have other people to come around them, how devastating that can be, or if they don't support the idea that how the person died in terms of maybe addictions, or if a person decided to take their life. So all this can be very traumatizing. And to kind of consider just how different cultures gather around together to really support each other in these processes of mourning, and how they can make a huge difference in terms of the experience that we have. I would say in my experience, the children were not very supportive. We probably should have had a specialty team come in. The pilot who died, his son was in my class, but kind of keeping in mind that culture can support these events. In terms of culture, I've been very blessed in terms of being in the Caribbean for 15 years, and also doing mission work in Latin America. But just consider in terms of the process that, and again, there's still an ethos in many cultures in terms of the Catholic influence, where in the Catholic influence, the idea of the visitation. For many cultures, it is important to see the deceased, to be able to mourn, to be able to talk around them. You hear not so often anymore, but the idea of the Irish wake, where people are able to be with the deceased loved one and still have that communal time, and almost an ethos that they are still in that room. Then also the idea of the gravesite, kind of the part of that idea of recognizing and starting that small but large process, that awareness that that person is gone. That person is gone. And then also the celebration of life afterwards. So all those things create a place in terms of being able to share. So that's key. I would say just in terms of different cultures, that's my exposure in terms of a pastor of a largely African Caribbean congregation. A lot of joy, a lot of music, a lot of remembrance. I had to watch out in terms of people when they start to share because they could go on with many people sharing. And also, again, a very traditional type of progression. With the Latino community, one of the things that kind of bringing attention to culture is the idea of having a place in the house to acknowledge your loved one, whether that be pictures or mementos or, even kind of bringing them flowers, lighting a candle next to their picture. I think that that has some value in terms of us having that continuing connection. And I can't say that grief somewhat has this process where it does change, but it takes time, but we can keep that memory of that loved one with us. So that idea of that, and I throw out the question, does grief have a purpose?
Mm.
And I believe it does. I believe it does. And regretfully, as a person that is older, the ELOS of the United States, the continental United States, has moved so quickly in terms of making grief very short term. So I really appreciate that, to have colleagues out there that do embrace grief. I have actually heard other colleagues encourage people to really move on very quickly, and it just does not work out well for them. It just leaves them lost. And the thing about keeping down grief is that it just tends to come back up. Another part of an Asian culture, I had a close friend that I went to college with that lived in Japan. I got to visit him, is that idea of really honoring our ancestors and talking about their legacies. I'm having a lot of fun in my retirement going through ancestry.com, but that has been very healing and really a gracious gift, that these people that have gone through so much in terms of one side of the family immigrating, the other side marrying into a Native American culture, that the richness that we have, and that's a part of who we are, and we can celebrate that. So I think that that's really key. But that idea of uplifting our ancestors and talking about them and telling the story, we've moved so far away from oral tradition. And then one of the most colorful, and we used to put this into a celebration where I worked at in terms of hospice, is how the Mexican community has celebrated the Day of the Dead, where maybe this isn't something that we have to handle with so much fear, but more of an embrace and a kind of a understanding that yes, we too are mortal, and this is always going to be a part of our life and our experience. And so just some thoughts, and being able to adapt in a society to these different thoughts. And also we are now dealing with, and again, I come from a Catholic Protestant family. So anyhow, so that as in therapy, we're also dealing with now very mixtures of ideas and cultures. For some people, it's like doing a PowerPoint, and other people, it's a very formal type of process in terms of what the funeral service would look like. And so we had to be open, and sometimes people, which again, as a therapist, I support, they have their own ideas. It's like, well, go for it.
Mhm.
Go for it, really make it unique, make it your own. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak and really just feel honored. Thank you.
Thank you,
I had a
David.
question, David. Oh,
Yes, sir.
Go ahead,
well,
Kurt.
I was just thinking about what you were explaining, and I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts, being that the continental is a country of primarily immigrants, it was founded on immigration, after indigenous peoples, of course. Why do you think that our culture doesn't necessarily embrace grief like other cultures does, or as outward?
I think it's been a process. I don't want to really point towards the funeral industry, but a lot of it has had to do also when you consider in terms of the way that we as a country has developed, where, and I'll just say my own experience. My brother's family is in Oklahoma. My sister's family is in Delaware, and they weren't able to come out for my dad's funeral. So that idea of that we are not quite the collective society, I think that is added to part of it, that we don't have that extended family necessarily close to it. I also think in terms of the way the funeral industry has gone, is that, and I'll use this as, it's expensive. I mean, again, as a minister, it was very pretty much wrote that we were going to have something at the church, something at the funeral home, something at graveside, and something afterwards. And now people can't necessarily afford that. And also the turn to cremation, where, and my wife's family they did not want to see the body. They wanted to move to the cremation and very quickly go through the process. So I think the value in terms of how we process the details of grief have really changed from a very slow approach where the body might have been on view for several days, and family gathered, and we had food and different events. And so that's just some thoughts. I wonder from the other therapists, what did they think?
Well, when I was doing a little bit of research for my book, what I found is that Christianity, and I have a Catholic upbringing, they have a wake and a funeral maybe, but there isn't anything beyond that. Whereas like in Buddhism, I'm going to get the days wrong, but you initially have a service, and I think at 40 days, 100 days, a year, and then every year, right? So all of these other countries that are more Buddhist, they just plug into these services. And I know when I've had clients who've done that, they talk about the 100-day memorials coming up, and everybody comes out from the community. And so what I love about that style, or not style, but is it actually is really aligned with grief. Because in the beginning, you're in so much shock. You don't even remember the first week, right? You don't even remember what people said. I always say, print it out, give it to the person. They're not going to remember. But by 100 days, you're kind of coming out of the fog. At a year, you're like really ready to have your people around you supporting you. So I wish American culture had just more, even if it was just an annual, right? Day of the Dead is great, because then you just do it and your community does it with you. You're not grieving alone. You're just expected, like, this is what you do. And we don't have that. And I think so many people are hurting because they're not done grieving and they're not done needing support. And it's already been 3 months and everyone else is done asking them about it. The meal train's over, right? And they're left really alone without a culture that knows how to help them grieve. So that's what I would add. I also want to say, David, I so appreciate everything you said before. I just really agree with everything you said. So thank you.
I think that brings up a good point too, when you bring up the Buddhist approach to grief, is they also embrace impermanence. And so death is a part of impermanence, and it's to be expected, and it's actually not doomed or feared, because they're embracing what comes next. And I think our modern day culture does not embrace impermanence very well. We're seeking how to stay young as long as we can, and surgeries and Botox and all this stuff, which teach your own. But I think it represents like the pursuit of permanence, not impermanence. And so if we don't know how to embrace impermanence, we're not going to know how to embrace grief or even hold space for someone else's grief.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
And if people don't have any idea about an afterlife or belief or anything, and if they're scared nothing else happens, it makes sense there'd be fear. Whereas these other, religions, they have a very detailed belief system of what happens next, where your ancestors are, the idea of maintaining relationships, even in death, that's normalized in those cultures. And I think it takes out a lot of the fear. Right.
Yeah, which I think leads to like what you're talking about, David, where people are trying to move people through grief quickly. Is I think some of that just comes from they don't know how to hold space,
Mhm.
and so they, for their own discomfort, they want the other person to feel better,
Yep.
so that then they feel better. And so the best approach to that is, feel better,
Yeah.
or
I
you'll feel
totally
better in a
agree.
year, or you'll feel
Mhm.
better in 6 months.
Right.
Right.
Move
Well, and I,
along.
I, I, I love that, Curtis, because even in hospice, we actually had a list in terms of when we did training for people. These are the things you don't say.
Yeah.
It's like, let's say it's your father. Well, you had them for 90 years, you know,
Right.
or, you know, or again, even religious innuendos. It's like, well, they're in heaven. And so all those
Mhm.
little things that we throw in there.
Yeah.
So,
Or the one,
again,
God only gives you what you can handle. People hate that. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
So
wow.
the day before my husband's memorial on Facebook, I ran across one of those lists, David, things you shouldn't say to someone who's just lost a loved one. So I just posted it on my Facebook page. And
Mhm.
at the memorial the next day, I had people say, "Thank you so much for posting that list. I feel terrible. I've been saying those things to people. So thank you. And now I'm just going to tell you that I love you and not say anything stupid."
Mhm.
So that was great. Okay, so let's move to Dawn's topic. Dawn wanted us to talk about sibling loss and the ways you help people with grief in your practice and in your book. And that would be kind of a great topic. So in your practice, and Curtis, we'll get to yours. And so in your practice specifically, what are the ways that you work with people in grief just
Yeah.
briefly?
Well, I think first of all, I let people tell their stories, right? What happened? Because again, so much of their focus is on how their parents are doing. If people even ask them how they are, it's how is your mom? It's almost never how are you? And so I let them tell their stories. I normalize grief symptoms. A lot of people don't know, you could feel depressed, you could feel exhausted, hard, difficulty concentrating, all of that, normalizing that. But I also talk about the change in family dynamics that maybe some people don't even think about, that now someone maybe is an only child for the first time in their life. And depending on their age, this means they are dealing with aging parents alone, which they never thought they would have to do. Or maybe they're the oldest sibling all of a sudden, if they have other siblings, or they're the youngest. This changes how you've been in the world your whole life up until that point, right? Not to mention talking about how impactful it is. And you shared a childhood with your siblings. They knew your family like nobody else. You thought you'd share a life with them. Like we talk about, you lose the past, present, and future, right? They're not going to know your kids if you haven't had them yet. And a lot of times I'm seeing younger people, they don't have their own families yet. And the idea that they're going to have children someday that their brother or sister will never know is deeply painful. That they're going to go through weddings or graduations without their sibling. They don't know how to do that. And so part of it is us talking about all these dynamics they will be dealing with, they are feeling it, nobody's really put a voice to. And so I do, and also helping prepare them for the birthdays, their siblings' birthday, their birthday, the anniversary of their passing, the holiday season. I'm sometimes one step ahead before because I know this is going to be really painful. Have you thought about it? Have you thought about how you want to honor your sibling? I do, but I don't know what to do. Let's brainstorm ideas together, right? Things like that are some of the things I do. I certainly will ask them about their spiritual beliefs. What do they think happens after somebody dies? A lot of times people don't know, especially if they're a little younger. If they're interested in books, I'll recommend books. Or nowadays, there's Facebook groups for siblings, there's podcasts. There was sort of none of that when I lost my brother. There's literally one book on sibling loss, which is mind-blowing. And it's the least researched loss that there is. I was just on a dissertation committee with someone who lost her brother, and she literally found 3 studies on the impact of losing a sibling as a young adult. Like 3. Like in an age where you get information on everything, it's absolutely shocking. And again, I think it goes back to people don't want to talk about grief and loss. They don't want to understand it. They're not researching it. It's just not happening. And so it's been, anyway, exciting sort of to be a part of, as a surviving sibling myself, changing that, being a part of changing that. And so with my clients, normalizing, you feel alone because of this is the situation, unfortunately, you're in, and this is what you can sort of do to help it get better. And then ideas on how to cope, some of the people for my book that I interviewed, they did organized walks if they lost a sibling to suicide or a health issue, And I really encourage people, because we don't have a society where you can plug into the annual memorial, the 100-day memorial, that doing these activities, it's helpful to channel your grief energy. It makes you feel better when you're doing something with your grief. And so kind of brainstorming ideas of what people can do. And other people talked about they made a garden and they grew flowers that reminded them of their siblings, certainly being in nature or exercising. So I feel like I help them through this grief journey, and also normalizing. You might only be at 1.5 years. In my mind, that is super raw. It's super early. That I talk about, we learn to live with loss. We don't move on from this type of loss because it changes you forever. And also not all the change is bad. And some of what I talk about when people are ready for that, which usually they can't hear until about 3 years, is that some of the ways you change actually enrich your life. And for me, that means I don't take time or relationships for granted. Like, the bubble burst that these bad things only happen to other people, or other families or people on TV. And once that bubble bursts, you're like, oh my goodness, I could lose everybody. Like, all these bad things can happen, the trauma response and the catastrophizing. But the other end of it is we all have a timeline. We don't know what it is. Let's be really mindful of what we do with our time. And I feel like I've lived my life prioritizing relationships. And so I talk to people about this, that there's a clarity sometimes with grief. You talked, David, about, is there a purpose? Like, I mean, when I see people come through and not over, but through and making meaning or sense out of what's happened, wow, they live life with intention. They have really clear priorities. And I do not see that in people who have not gone through significant loss. They still live life as if there's plenty of time. I'll spend time with, whatever other people later. We'll do that someday. And that's not how people, I think, live or think sometimes when they've gone through significant loss. It changes them. So anyway, these are the types of things I talk about with people and help them through. And I will say there are some people that if the nightmares, the flashbacks, the trauma response is not helped alone through talk therapy, and there's plenty, enter Curtis and his group. We have shared clients together for many years now, and I think it just absolutely complements their work, because I could talk about the everyday, how did it go at work, how did it go with your mom or whatnot, and with Curtis, he really hones in on the trauma response. And I think that's been just wildly helpful. And I'll always ask people, does it feel redundant? Does it feel like too much? Every time they'll say, no, it's just so different, and both feel really helpful. So, yeah.
So David, how about in your work specifically? Thank you, Don. That's awesome. Those are all, it's just so great that you fleshed this out so much for siblings. These are all really things my brain's going, oh yeah.
Thank you.
I had a thought, Dawn.
Yeah.
When you were talking, I'm a sibling, and so I was thinking about my own relationship with my siblings and like how that could be impacted if there was loss there. And one thing it made me think of was the emotion that I see so common with grief, which is regret. I kind of always tell people I feel like regret should be added in kind of the traditional Kubler-Ross stages of grief, because everybody just has it. But because of the sibling dynamic, like there's like sibling conflict and that you just kind of get used to, right? Sibling rivalry. And like, I could see how that could complicate the grief process if it's like, oh man, I was kind of beefing with my sibling when this happened, or like not the close relationship I wanted to have, or unresolved issues.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because it's true. Not all the siblings that come in were super close, especially on a lot of the podcast interviews. They talk about that, especially if their sibling was addicted to drugs and alcohol. There was all kind of just, rupture in the relationship, breakdown of trust, setting boundaries. No, I'm not going to help you out. And then so much pain and guilt or regret if their sibling ended up dying. And they talk about that. What's really hard with that type of loss too is the death represents the end of a chance that it would ever get better, right? That there isn't going to be a repair now. I mean, I still talk about it. I think we could still continue to have relationships, and how do we do that? But the reality is they're not physically here, and it does end the chance that you ever get to hug it out, say I'm sorry, say the things you wish. And so for some people, it wasn't that the relationship was such a great relationship itself, but that they don't now ever get to make it better. And that's where a lot of the grief and loss is too for them.
I agree. When the relationship has been complicated with it, everything is different. My brother was high functioning Asperger's, and he lived 67 hard, miserable years. He never fit in. He kind of lived with all of us. We sort of rotated him around the country because he really couldn't do the activities of daily living. And so when he died, it was a relief because the torture was over. And he believed that he was going to heaven and he wouldn't have Asperger's anymore. And so it's very complicated to be so relieved that your brother's torture is over. But like you said, Don, now there's no chance of a miracle where he actually can show up as the awesome person that was trapped under all that complication. And it's just really sad. So he just died about a year and a half ago.
Oh, so sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, still fresh.
Very fresh. Don, I'm so glad that you brought up about that idea. My brother died at 64.
Oh, wow.
And we came from a blended family, and he was somewhat the Esau and I was somewhat the Jacob because I was from the second family. And so, yeah, that idea that once they die, how do you resolve anything else? Thankfully, I'm relational, like you have suggested, and I've been able to pour into his children, which we've always had a good relationship. But in terms of that whole ethos of what happened with my brother and my dad and the divorce, that's gone. And that does weigh on you. So I'm really glad from a therapeutic approach that, that there's people out there that are interested in hearing that dynamic. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
It's interesting. I'll just mention because this just happened. Actually, this morning I got another text from this man, 67 years old, watched a YouTube interview I did a while back and reached out and said, I'm 67. I lost my sister 57 years ago. He was 10, she was 12. And I was just, he was saying he was inspired by my book, but it was such an example. This man has lived over 5 decades carrying the loss of his sibling. And I would imagine has probably not told a lot of people about it. He's a man. This happened a long time ago. People didn't talk about grief. They still barely do now. They certainly haven't, didn't then. And he's actually going to be on a podcast that I connected him with someone I knew that was looking for people. And he's going to be on the show. And it's just, to me, it's like amazing that this man has lived his whole life around the loss of his sister. And most people would have thought he'd have been over it by now. And that's just not how it works. And I could come up with a dozen more examples of how, people carry the love of their sibling really forever. Whether it was complicated or not, it sort of, I think a lot of times still lives in them. And it's a matter, I feel like as a therapist, for us to help. What do you do with that? What do you do with that you're carrying? And how do you find any maybe peace in that, if there's a way to? And my hope is that there's a way to for people.
And I think that's really important because I think it can be easy for people to get caught in the thinking of like, well, why go to therapy? It won't bring my loved one back. Like, there's nothing I can do, with grief. But I think what you're talking about is like, there are ways we can navigate grief that help us move through it. Yes, it doesn't take grief away. It doesn't bring the loved one back, but it does help us learn how to cope and walk through it in a less disturbing way, or connect to a healthier relationship with it.
Absolutely.
Yep. So Curtis, that is a great way to move to your topic, which is complicated grief, or grief that's complicated by unprocessed or even unrecognized trauma. So it's like the last straw.
Yeah, big topic, definitely. And thanks for having me on. It was interesting when I was talking to my wife about it. This type of stuff is always good for me because I always grow from this myself. And so I was talking to her about like, yeah, I'm going to talk about traumatic grief, and I'm like, I'm supposed to share my own experience, but I don't think I'm connected to traumatic grief. And it just is a reminder of like my own avoidant tendencies. That's kind of like my default that I've always had to work on. Because I was reminded, so I'm 2 days away from my birthday. And on my 10th birthday, my dad's best friend's son got in a car accident and died. And so my birthday party was shut down on my 10th birthday. And these were, I would like call them cousins. They weren't blood relatives, but everything had to stop. My dad had to drive out to Sacramento from Santa Rosa to come be with them. And, of course, there was the funeral. And that was my first introduction to grief at 10 years old. And not even fully wrapping my head around it, but kind of seeing the impact, especially on the parents that had, and that being a traumatic grief. And it's kind of like a whack myself in the face moment. Like, yeah, Curtis, you've had some traumatic grief there for sure. And I lost a dog very suddenly in December, and it's just a good reminder for me that there's grief there that I need to be aware of and get in touch with. So thanks for having me on. And yeah, so when I think of grief and I'm talking to clients about grief, I kind of go through like there's expected grief. There's like the anticipated grief that we understand. There's complicated grief where it may even still be expected, but there's a complicated relationship there. A parent, your brother, a parent who passes, and it's kind of complicated dynamics. And then there's traumatic grief, and traumatic grief, I explain, is unexpected, disturbing, violent, shocking. It connects people to the words I think we use a lot, all too not as sensitive, of terrifying, heartbreaking, gut-wrenching. When you think of those words literally, I think a lot of those words have come from people's experience with traumatic grief, because it's hard to even put words to, and those kind of come close. And so a lot of these are, as I mentioned, overdoses and combat traumatic grief, suicide, murder, violent car accidents, witnessing death can be traumatic grief. And I think what I try to explain to people is the grieving process is already challenging, especially in our culture, as we've talked about, all the different dynamics. If you add trauma onto it, now we're kind of combining PTSD and grief together. And that's going to intensify the grieving process. It's going to prolong the grieving process. It's going to complicate it with various layers of PTSD symptoms with it, which grief already comes with. So you might just imagine that being intensified, of nightmares and flashbacks and hypervigilance and avoidance of situations that might connect someone to that grief. And I think because the brain and the body are so focused on survival first, when there's traumatic grief and the brain is encoding the trauma, it then it kind of prioritizes the trauma before the grieving process can fully start. And so the person's kind of in this hijacked traumatic state, and they can't just move into grieving because it's being disrupted by trauma symptoms. And I think of trauma as the prolonged response to a disturbing event. Some people experience traumatic events and aren't necessarily traumatized, but some people, that trauma response continues. If you think of like a flinch, if something's thrown at us, like think of that flinch just continuing onward and not being able to stop. That is a trauma response. So with traumatic grief, we're often having to then bring in modalities beyond talk therapy that are generally very helpful. But when it comes to trauma, they're not able to get into that limbic system, that somatic experience. And so we're using EMDR or somatic therapies or brain spotting. The great news is there's so many now. There's the comprehensive resource model. I've been working on a model called the affect regulation protocol, and there's sensory motor psychotherapy. There's so much that is meant to help work on this trauma response, so that if you think of that flinch can kind of start to settle. And it doesn't take grief away, but it can then help someone start to navigate that grieving process without being hijacked by PTSD.
Curtis, that's so great that you mentioned about the trauma response. It makes sense that if we have clients that are stuck in trauma for a year or two before they even seek treatment, of course they're not able to really work on their grief so much because they're still stuck in that response system. And then after they get through that, then they can maybe talk about their feelings, right? And whereas it's society's like, 6 months, you're not over it, like they haven't even begun really, because they're stuck in still having trauma responses. So that makes a lot of sense too, why it's prolonged in society's eyes, or prolonged in terms of them feeling better.
Yeah, and there's often then an avoidance with that because grief is
Right.
already uncomfortable. If there's now a traumatic response with that, there's more of a tendency for the person to avoid, whether through dissociation or numbing with alcohol or pills or whatever it is. And so absolutely then stunts that process from being able to continue.
That
Yeah,
totally makes
we've
sense.
been good at like dissociation and avoidance. We become masters when we're in the grief. I tell people, because I have had so much complicated work to do in my life, that just, since my husband died, all the abandonment stuff and all those kind of things, like my turn. So I tell people it feels like it's hard enough to grieve as a grown-up, but when a bunch of really young, unprocessed trauma firing, being a 6-year-old trying to grieve 44 years of marriage makes it much more complicated.
That's actually a great point that I didn't mention. I'm glad you brought it up, because one thing I explain is the brain doesn't process trauma necessarily around context. Context is important, but it's more processing emotion and sensation. And so if there's a traumatic grief that triggers a feeling like abandonment, hopelessness, helplessness, feeling trapped, feeling violated, any of these emotions that then might mimic trauma from earlier in life, then now we're also having a more complicated trauma and grief response where they're experiencing like present day traumatic grief, and their own trauma can get triggered and resurfaced from some of these experiences. And I actually see that a lot when someone's in a car accident, they feel trapped, and helpless, and then it resurfaces unresolved childhood trauma. And so that also really complicates it. Now they're processing past and present trauma.
Well,
I
I'm
feel
glad.
honestly that, oh, sorry, go David.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just thinking about, like, I call it like the grief and loss file, like inner psyche almost. And so if you go through one loss, it almost is like your whole file is opened up. You have more access to all your past losses, even breakups and all kinds of stuff is just sort of in that file. So you're right, people then are dealing with lots of other past loss, not just the one at hand, which is
Yeah,
so
I like
heavy,
that.
right? It's so much for people, or all of us go through that.
David?
Oh, and I was just going to say, and I'm glad that Curtis had brought up this aspect. I've mentioned the airline crash. My sister to this day does not fly. And in my own therapeutic journey, I kept wondering why between the ages of 6 and 13 that I would have dreams of my dad dying. And the minute he retired from flying, the dreams stopped. So that idea that it can lodge really deep into us, and to be in that place of being able to process with somebody, it's like, why am I having these dreams? Why can't I fly? It's really important.
And the self-judgment of what's wrong with me? Why can't I be like everyone else? Like I have said for years, why am I always the craziest person in the room? But when I started through really deep therapy, I mean, I knew my story. It's like this movie I can describe to you, these really crazy people who all lived in a house together. But in terms of being able to acknowledge the impact it had on me and my present day functioning, so learning all of that kind of therapy that Curtis and I do, now I can say, well, no wonder you're like that. Of course you're like that. How else could you be? Look at your family. Where would you have learned how to do that? Television? And I've always said I learned everything about being a grown-up from a book, a therapist, or a class. And yet, like Curtis said, between the denial and then the self-recrimination, I always think of that second, like someone has to say, well, look at what, oh, that's right. Okay. So remembering to be gracious and kind to myself when I go off into what I judge as crazy land. So I have like this dual relationship with myself. There's the therapist self that gets all this cool stuff. And then there's the trauma victim who says, shut up. So I really love working with people and helping them notice both voices and maybe get that nice one to take up more space in the process.
I think that's important for kind of the type of grief we're all talking about, because I would imagine we're all wanting to help foster self-compassion. I think another theme that I see a lot with grief is survivor's guilt, and that guilt of like, why them? It should have been me, or and the torture that can create, and fostering some compassion for themselves with the grief, I think is really important.
Absolutely.
I think that's hugely important. Everything you've all said, by normalizing and telling people now you can expect this and you can expect this. So we all have the tendency to pathologize everything that's happening, like I'm doing it wrong, or that means I'm crazy or bad, and instead, oh, here I am going down the steps of grief.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's
Okay.
how do we get to post-traumatic growth? What are the paths there? How can we do that? But not in a hurried way, but really honoring the process, taking time, and really just helping people not feel so alone in their whole experience, which I think most people feel very alone with grief.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I like that you said like not rushing the process. I think it's so easy and such a trend these days to get caught up in like, what's the magic pill or the magic button that fixes me? Right now it's like psychedelic therapy. And I think there's always this hope of like, if I go take this, maybe I'll feel better right away. And yes, the trauma modalities that we utilize can help move that process along a little quicker. I don't like to think of it as fast. I don't think healing is fast. I think it is slow, especially if we want complete healing. And you know, having a therapist that can hold space for that and really honor everything that's there, and especially in traumatic grief and really heavy grief, I think you need a clinician that is grounded, that has done their own work. I appreciate all of you here. We're all talking about doing our own work, because our capacity to go places with clients will never exceed our capacity where we can go ourselves. And I hear it all the time with clients of, I knew you were going to help me because you didn't flinch when I said my rawest trauma. You know, I think therapists need a clinician with guts and courage and being able to sit with that really heavy stuff so that they can move through it.
And
I
think
agree.
having experienced loss, I say all the time, I've always felt confident in my ability as a therapist, and a lot of having gone through a lot, like you said, Curtis, there's nothing anyone can tell me that's going to freak me out. But at the same time, I realized I would have told you 10 years ago that I was a great grief therapist, but it was not till after my husband died. Now I'm a great grief therapist.
Right.
That makes sense.
So
There's a Celtic prayer that I use often with people, again, on my population as faith-based, but it talks about do not hurry as you walk through grief. And I think that that's really key, that, you know, there is something to this journey, and to be able to process it with people and process it in a very safe environment, it just can make a huge, huge difference.
absolutely. So in closing, often people don't watch all of YouTube videos. So if you could capture the one most important thing, like 1 minute of wisdom that we could leave people with, and if you felt like they carried that out of this, that you would have done the thing you came here to do. So just kind of think about that for a second, kind of tie that up. What do you want to leave us with? David, would you like to start with that?
I would encourage people to reach out, to somewhat look at the support that you have, but not to be afraid to seek outside support. I just think that it's so key, and it can make such a huge difference. And I love what Don said, that, you know, this is a difference that can be life-changing, which again, I think that we've expressed in our own therapeutic journeys. It can be life-changing, but it can be also something that actually makes us a new creation through the process of experiencing grief.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, Curtis, what would you like to leave us with?
I think the first thought that came to my mind was the phrase stuck, not broken. And that when it comes to traumatic grief, there's often such a fear of doing that work. And when I explain to people of how therapy can help them move through some of the lingering symptoms, I get it all the time of like, I believe you're telling me the truth, but I don't believe it. You know, and they can't even fathom another reality of not living with the intense PTSD symptoms that they're stuck with. And so I really want to kind of send the message that there is help and there is relief. And this is an age of technology where we have better understanding and better tools to really help people move through trauma and traumatic grief than we ever have in any other time. And so I think just recognizing that it's just about being stuck and not broken.
Mm. I like that, Curtis. I haven't heard that before.
I do too. Okay, Dawn, what would you like to leave us with?
Oh, man. So I think I agree with what everyone's saying. But in terms of sibling loss, just really validating how deeply impactful it is. It's a life-changing experience that people live with their whole life. And that to get help, but actually the right help. So even if they seek, and I highly recommend seeking out therapy, but I tell people it's really important that they try to find someone who says they specialize in grief and loss and to maybe dig a little into it. Like, what do they do with that? Not that they're just trying to fill hours in their schedule and like, sure, I'll see someone, but that they have some experience with really significant loss so that the therapist doesn't actually say things that are more hurtful, you really need to be moving on now. It's been a whole year. Like that's not what should ever be said, I don't think. So getting help from the right sources and not trying to do it alone. So maybe finding the books on sibling loss, because I think the books have lots and lots of good ideas, how to cope, other books, other ideas on how to honor their sibling, the idea that this is something you do in your life, and normalizing that you can still have a relationship with your sibling. It'll be different, but it doesn't mean it has to end. And what does that look like? And maybe going to some groups if they can find it. And even with their friends or partners, to ask their friends or partners to check in with them about their grief or to put the date that they lost their sibling on their calendar. I know my sister asked her best friend, I need you to put January 8th on and check in every year. I need to know someone outside of our family knows what that day means to me. And I need you to bring it up to me. And to do that, because people want to support us, they just don't know how to. And so I think if we can give them something to do that, there's a better chance that you'll get supported. And again, to not try to do it alone. It's too hard to do alone. So
Absolutely. That's such great information. And so that's kind of my theme song is finding a group, but making sure it's a good group. Like you need a group that's well moderated, where someone can't talk for the entire hour. But they're encouraged to move other people along. I went to the Widowed Persons Association of California, and it was great. It's been around a long time. And not only did they offer a place where you could come and just share and tell your story and get nods and smiles and hugs, but they have a full social calendar of fun things for grieving people to do. Because it's really important to be around people that can hold space for your grief and not like, oh, I got an appointment, I'll see you later. But people who can be deeply with you in the moments of anguish and then tolerate some grieving jokes because that helps too. And so finding those kind of groups, and like Dawn said, I think it's critically important that someone can describe how have you come to call yourself a grief specialist. Because I know I talk to a lot of people who call themselves trauma-informed therapists, and all that means is they've taken some classes about trauma, which is way different than actually getting specialized training and personal experience in working with trauma. So,
right.
but don't try to do this alone. It just is deadly. Anytime someone as sad as I was, the first year my husband died, is left alone unattended, it's not a good idea. So I want to think. I thank you so much for being willing to participate in this, and it's just awesome to be reminded of what amazing people are out there working in the field and changing lives. And
thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for putting this together.
Thank you very much for doing this.
And I will see you all later.
Thank you,
Sounds
Barbara.
good. Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.